The first time Charlotte Crawford walked into the Bristol ranch with nothing but a battered sewing basket and a spine made of iron, she had no idea she was walking into the wreckage of a man's entire life. The year was 1873, deep in the heart of the Texas Panhandle, where the wind never stopped talking, and the dust never stopped moving, and men like Isaiah Bristol built their empires on the backs of cattle and silence. The town of Caldwell Crossing sat 30 miles south of Amarillo proper, a stubborn little settlement that clung to the flat earth like it was daring the prairie to shake it loose. There was a general store, a livery, a church that doubled as a courthouse on Saturdays, 3 saloons, and enough hardscrabble ambition to fill a canyon. People came to Caldwell Crossing for 2 reasons: because they were running towards something or because they were running away from it. Charlotte Crawford was firmly in the first category. She had arrived 6 weeks prior on the eastbound stage from New Mexico, carrying a single trunk, the sewing basket her mother had pressed into her hands before she died, and a letter of recommendation from a schoolteacher in Santa Fe who had vouched for Charlotte's skills with a needle and thread as though they were sacred gifts. She was 24 years old, brown-haired, brown-eyed, with hands that were already calloused and a face that was pretty in an honest, unsentimental way. Not the kind of pretty that men wrote poetry about, but the kind that made them look twice without knowing why. She had taken a small room above the Caldwell Crossing post office, put up a modest hand-lettered sign on the board outside the mercantile, and waited. Seamstress for hire. Mending, alterations, new garments. Reasonable rates. See Charlotte Crawford ATLUNDQUISTS Postal. Work had trickled in slowly. Mrs. Hargrove needed her wedding dress let out. The schoolteacher, Mr. Abernathy, needed patches on 3 pairs of trousers. A couple of the saloon girls wanted new collars on their working dresses and paid Charlotte with coins they'd pressed flat from handling too much. Charlotte took every job without complaint, worked by lamplight when the daylight ran out, and kept careful track of every penny in a small leather book her father had left her before he too had died, 3 years back, leaving her with nothing but independence and the terrifying freedom that came with having no one left to answer to. It was Hester Doyle, who ran the laundry service 3 doors down from the post office, who first mentioned Isaiah Bristol. "Man's a disaster in sheep's clothing," Hester announced one afternoon while Charlotte sat at the small work table she'd wedged into the corner of her room, running a needle through a length of calico. Hester had a habit of appearing in doorways uninvited, but she always brought gossip and sometimes food, so Charlotte tolerated it with grace. "Owns half the grazing land between here and the canyon wall. Biggest cattle operation in this county. Rides into town twice a week for supplies like some kind of biblical figure descending from a mountain. Scares half the town just by looking at them." "And what's the disaster part?" Charlotte asked without lifting her eyes from her stitching. "Everything else," Hester said simply. "Lost his wife 2 years back, fever. Before that, lost a baby boy the year before. Man's got 2 ranch hands who are too afraid of him to do laundry properly, a cook who only knows beef 3 ways, and from what I hear, his shirts are in such a state that decent society has given up hoping." She paused. "I was thinking you might go out there and offer your services. If he wants mending done, he can come to me like everyone else." "Charlotte," Hester said, with the patience of a woman who had been managing difficult things for a long time, "men like Isaiah Bristol do not come to anybody. They have to be gone too." Charlotte had said no that day. She said no the next day too, when Hester brought it up again over coffee. But the 3rd day, when the rent on her room came due and the coins in her leather book were looking painfully sparse, she packed her sewing basket, borrowed Mrs. Hargrove's small roan mare, and rode the 4 miles out to the Bristol ranch with her back straight and her jaw set and her pride only slightly bent. The Bristol ranch was not what she expected. She had expected something grand, because Hester had described it as an empire, and empires tended toward grandeur. What she found instead was a place that had been grand once and was slowly forgetting itself. The main house was large, built from good lumber, with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides and windows that looked out over the plains with a kind of mournful dignity. But the porch boards needed replacing. The window on the east side was patched with oilcloth instead of glass. The flower beds that had clearly once lined the front path were choked with dry weeds, the ghost of whoever had planted them still visible in the careful arrangement beneath the overgrowth. There were two outbuildings, a barn that was in better repair than the house because cattle needed shelter more than men apparently did, and a smaller structure she took to be the bunkhouse. 3 horses stood in the paddock, watching her arrive with mild curiosity. A dog of indeterminate breed was sleeping on the porch stairs and did not bother to lift its head. Charlotte dismounted, tied the roan to the post, stepped over the sleeping dog, climbed the porch stairs, and knocked on the door. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then she heard boots on floorboards, heavy and deliberate, the walk of a man who had nowhere to hurry to. The door opened. Isaiah Bristol was 31 years old, and he looked like the land had made him broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw covered in several days of beard that was not quite intentional enough to be called a style. He had gray eyes, the kind of gray that shifted between silver and storm depending on the light, and they settled on Charlotte with an expression that was not quite rude but was definitely not welcoming. He was wearing a work shirt that had a tear along the left shoulder seam wide enough to put 3 fingers through. "Whatever you're selling, I don't need it," he said. "Good," Charlotte said. "I'm not selling anything." "My name is Charlotte Crawford. I'm a seamstress. I heard you had some shirts that needed mending and I need work, so here I am." He looked at her for a long moment, then looked at her sewing basket, then looked back at her face as though trying to find the angle in it. "Who told you about the shirts?" "Half the town." Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement but adjacent to it. "That right. Your shirt has a tear in the shoulder seam right now," Charlotte said helpfully. "I can see it from here. I can fix that one for 15 cents, and if you have others in a similar state, we can work out a fair price for the lot." He leaned against the door frame, arms crossing over his chest. "You rode 4 miles for 15 cents. "I rode 4 miles for the business that comes after the first 15 cents, Charlotte said calmly. "That's how commerce works, Mr. Bristol." Another long pause. The dog on the stairs shifted and made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a snore. Isaiah Bristol looked at Charlotte the way a man looks at something unexpected that he doesn't quite know what to do with yet. Then he stepped back from the door and held it open. "Come in, then." The inside of the house was clean in the way that a place gets when it has been scrubbed of personality as well as dirt. There was furniture, good furniture, well made, but it sat in the rooms like it had been arranged by someone who was thinking about function and nothing else. There were no curtains on any of the windows Charlotte could see. There was a rifle above the fireplace and a calendar on the wall, and a single framed photograph on the mantelpiece that she did not look at directly because she could feel it from across the room, and she already understood what it was. Isaiah led her through the main room and into a back hallway, where a door opened into what might have once been a laundry room, and was now simply a room where laundry went to despair. There was a wooden table, a deep basin, a line of hooks on the wall, and piled on the table with an air of profound suffering were 12 shirts in various states of disrepair. Charlotte set her basket down, pulled out the nearest shirt, and examined it with the calm professional eye of a woman who has seen worse. Collar worn through, cuff fraying on the right, a button missing at the 3rd position. She set it down and picked up the next one. "This one's been mended before," she said, holding up a blue cotton shirt where someone had made a brave attempt at a patch that had not quite succeeded. Not badly done, but the thread didn't match, and whoever did it was in a hurry. "The hands tried," Isaiah said from the doorway. He had stayed in the doorway, she noticed that. "Walt. He was willing, but his eyesight isn't what it was." "I can redo all of these properly," Charlotte said. "It will take me most of the day. I'll charge you a flat rate 50 cents for all 12, including buttons replaced and collars reinforced where they need it. If you have any that need new thread throughout because they're too far gone to salvage, I'll tell you before I do extra work and you can decide." Isaiah Bristol looked at her with those storm-gray eyes for a moment. 50 cents. It's fair, Charlotte said. I'm not gouging you. No, he said slowly. I don't think you are. He pushed off the door frame. I'll have Martinez bring you water if you need it. There's coffee on the stove. Help yourself. She thought he would leave then, but he lingered for a moment, and she could feel the weight of something he wasn't saying pressing against the air between them. Then he turned, and his boots sounded down the hallway, and she heard the front door. And through the window she watched him cross the yard toward the barn with the kind of purposeful stride that meant he was going to find something hard to do with his hands. Charlotte spread the shirts out on the table, sorted them by severity of need, threaded her needle, and got to work. She was 3 shirts in when she heard someone in the kitchen and smelled coffee being refreshed. A few minutes later, a young Mexican man with a round face and careful eyes appeared in the doorway holding a tin mug. He couldn't have been more than 19. "Martinez?" Charlotte asked. "Yes, ma'am. Senor Bristol said to bring water if you needed, but I thought coffee was better." He extended the mug. Charlotte smiled and took it. "It is, thank you. How long have you worked here?" 3 years. He leaned against the door frame in almost the same position his employer had occupied earlier, though where Isaiah had been watchful and guarded, Martinez was simply curious. "Since before Senora Bristol died. I came with my father, but my father went back to San Antonio last winter. I stayed." "Why?" Martinez seemed to consider the question seriously. "Because the boss needed staying. He does not always know it, but he does." Charlotte looked at the young man for a moment. "You're fond of him." "He is not easy to know," Martinez said carefully, "but he is worth the trouble." He straightened. "I will leave you to your work, miss." Charlotte drank her coffee and thought about that, and returned to her stitching. By mid-afternoon she had finished 8 of the 12 shirts and was moving at a steady pace when the front door opened again, and boots crossed the floor and Isaiah Bristol appeared in the doorway of the laundry room. He had dust on his forearms and his hat in his hand, and he looked at the neat stack of finished shirts on the corner of the table, with an expression Charlotte could not quite read. "You're fast," he said. "I've been doing this for a long time." She didn't look up from the shirt in her hands, her needle moving in and out with the rhythmic certainty of long practice. He came into the room then, which he hadn't done before, and leaned against the table with what might have been casualness, and was actually a man forcing himself to be less rigid than he felt. He picked up one of the finished shirts and looked at the collar, then at the cuff, then at the third button which she had replaced with one that was not quite a perfect match for the others but was close enough. "This is good work," he said. "I know." He set the shirt down. "Where are you from originally?" "You're not Texas. New Mexico Territory, before that Kansas, before that Virginia." She tied off her thread and cut it. "My father moved us west when I was 12. He thought he'd find a fortune in silver." She paused, picking up the next shirt. "He found quite a bit of hard work and not much silver." "And your family is where now?" Charlotte smoothed the shirt across her lap. "I'm the family now. My parents have both passed. I have no siblings." She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, the way you state a fact about the weather. "It's just me and the sewing basket." Something crossed Isaiah Bristol's face, not quite pity, because she hadn't offered it as something pitiful, but recognition, perhaps. The understanding of someone who has also been the last one standing in their own small corner of the world. "I'll let you finish," he said, and left. She finished all 12 shirts before the sun began to decline toward the western edge of the sky, and packed them neatly and stacked them on the table and cleaned her needles and put them away in their proper places in the basket. She was putting on her light wool jacket when Isaiah came back in. He paid her the 50 cents without haggling, and then stood there for a moment looking at the stacked shirts, and then at her, and then at some middle distance between the two. "I have a pair of work trousers," he said carefully, "that are beyond what Walt attempted and probably beyond what I should be asking." Charlotte picked up her basket. "Bring them to me in town. I'll be in my room above the postal." Another pause. Then, in the tone of a man making a business decision and nothing else, nothing whatsoever, I also have some curtains that were put away in a trunk. My wife, they were hers. They need rehanging. I thought it might be time." He stopped, started again. "I don't know the first thing about curtains." Charlotte looked at him steadily. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the window where the light was coming through without anything to soften it. "I can come back Thursday," she said quietly, "if you want the curtains up." "Thursday," he said, like he was testing the word. "Yes, all right." She rode back to Caldwell Crossing with the 50 cents in her pocket and the image of that bare window in her mind, and the words of Martinez drifting alongside her in the warm evening air. "He is worth the trouble." Thursday came, and Charlotte came with it, and this time she brought not just her sewing basket but a small bag of additional tools. A level, a small hammer she'd borrowed from Mr. Abernathy, a handful of curtain rings, and a good working knowledge of how to make a dark house feel less like a held breath. Isaiah met her on the porch this time, which was different from the first visit, and he had washed and changed into one of the mended shirts, which she noticed and did not mention. He led her through the house and upstairs to where a cedar trunk sat in the largest bedroom, pushed against the wall under the bare window. He opened it and stepped back. The curtains were beautiful, gold and white, good cotton, with a small embroidered border along the bottom that had been done by hand. Charlotte reached into the trunk and lifted them carefully, feeling the quality of the fabric. They were also completely clean, folded with enormous care, preserved with cedar chips. Someone had loved these curtains very much. "She made them," Isaiah said from across the room, his voice entirely neutral, the way a voice gets when it's working very hard to stay that way. "Eleanor, the spring after we got married. She'd ordered the fabric from a catalog and it took 3 months to arrive and she was so proud of them." He stopped. "I took them down after she died. I don't know why." Charlotte held the curtains gently in her hands. "Do you want them back up?" "Yes." He said it like he'd made the decision before she arrived and was only just hearing himself say it for the first time. "Yes." "I do." "Then I'll put them up." She spent an hour doing it properly, and Isaiah stayed in the room with her, which surprised her. He sat in the chair by the empty fireplace and did not speak, but he watched her work the way a man watches something that is necessary and possibly frightening, and he cannot look away from. When she finally stepped back and the curtains fell into place across the bedroom window, catching the afternoon light and turning it golden, Isaiah Bristol made a sound that was very small and very private and that Charlotte heard and immediately pretended she had not. "They look good," she said briskly, gathering her things. "Yes." His voice was rough. "They do." She had been paid for the curtain hanging and was at the door of the bedroom when he spoke again. "Will you stay for supper?" She turned. He was still in the chair by the cold fireplace, his hands clasped between his knees, his gray eyes direct and uncertain at the same time. "Martinez makes beef stew," he added. "It's one of his 3 dishes, but he does it well." Charlotte thought of her room above the postal, which would be empty and cold at supper hour, and the tin of crackers she'd been planning to eat standing over her work table. She thought about the curtains in the golden light and the small sound he'd made. "All right," she said, "if there's enough." "There's always enough," he said. "I don't eat much." There was indeed enough, and Martinez served it with a barely concealed expression of triumph that he directed at Isaiah when Isaiah was looking away, and the 3 of them ate in the kitchen because the dining room felt too large and too formal for Thursday evening, though neither Isaiah nor Charlotte said so aloud. They talked carefully around the edges of things, the price of beef, the state of the road between Caldwell Crossing and the canyon, whether the winter was going to come early this year. Martinez contributed cheerfully, and at length whenever the conversation stalled. It was on the ride back to town, in the cooling evening air with the stars beginning to assert themselves across the enormous Texas sky, that Charlotte admitted to herself that Isaiah Bristol was not what she had expected. She had expected a man made entirely of grief and grim self-sufficiency, a boulder with a face, the kind of man who could only be navigated around, never through. Instead, she had found something more complicated. A man who was, in fact, exactly that, but who had a cedar trunk in his bedroom with carefully preserved curtains in it, and who stayed in the room while someone hung them, and who asked a near stranger to stay for supper because the house was too quiet without it. She came back the following Tuesday for the trousers, which were indeed in a dreadful state, and the Tuesday after that because he had found 2 more shirts he'd forgotten about, and the Tuesday after that for no particular reason that either of them clearly articulated, but which had to do with the fact that Martinez had mentioned the apple trees at the south end of the property were coming in, and Charlotte had mentioned that she knew how to make apple preserves, and somehow that had become a reason. She made the preserves in the Bristol kitchen on a warm October afternoon, while Martinez hovered nearby learning the technique with great seriousness, and Isaiah sat at the kitchen table with his account books, which was something he'd never done in the kitchen before, and which everyone present pretended was perfectly normal. The smell of cooking apples and cinnamon filled every corner of the house, and at some point Charlotte looked up from the stove and found Isaiah watching her instead of his accounts, with an expression so unguarded that she had to look away quickly and attend very carefully to the stirring. "You should get some of these windows reglazed before winter," she said to the middle distance. "The oilcloth on the east window won't hold when the cold wind comes in off the plains." "I know," he said. "I keep meaning to. Meaning to doesn't keep the cold out." "No," he said. "It doesn't," and she could tell from his voice that they were not entirely talking about windows anymore, though neither of them was ready to say what they were talking about instead. October moved into November, and Charlotte's visits to the Bristol ranch had become something Caldwell Crossing had quietly noticed and was quietly discussing. Hester Doyle, who had started this whole enterprise, was smugly pleased with herself and said so often. Mrs. Hargrove thought it was very nice that the poor man was having some female society again. Mr. Abernathy, the schoolteacher, observed that Charlotte's lamp was burning later in her room than it used to and attributed this to her being busy, which was true, though not only in the way he meant it. What Caldwell Crossing didn't know was that Isaiah Bristol had started coming into town on Tuesdays specifically, regardless of whether he needed supplies, and that he had a habit of appearing at the post office in the late afternoon when he knew Charlotte would be finishing her work, and walking with her to the Calico Diner for coffee, and that these coffees had extended from 20 minutes to 2 hours without either of them seeming to notice time was passing. They talked the way people talk when they've been careful for a long time and have discovered someone they don't need to be careful with eagerly, a little hungrily, about everything. About the books they'd read. About the land and what it meant to build something on it. About loss, which they came to carefully from the sides, the way you approach a fire when you're not sure of its heat. She told him about her father first, the big dreamer who had died with dust in his lungs and hope still mysteriously intact. He told her about his father in return, a banker in Virginia who had considered Isaiah a disappointment for every one of his 31 years and said so regularly, which explained a great deal about why Isaiah had come as far west as geography allowed. "What made you choose cattle?" Charlotte asked on one of these Tuesday afternoons. The diner was mostly empty at this hour, and outside the window the November wind was doing its best with the dust. "I was good at it," Isaiah said simply. "I understand cattle, they're straightforward, they want water and grass and to be left alone. I can give them that." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "People are more complicated." "You're good with Martinez," she said. "Martinez doesn't require much," he said. "He just needs someone not to leave." Charlotte looked at him steadily. Was that the problem before? People leaving? He met her eyes, and she saw something open and close in his expression like a door briefly ajar. "Eleanor didn't leave by choice," he said. "Fever took her fast, 12 days. He paused. "The baby that was the winter before, James we had named him. He lived 3 days." He set the cup down. "I don't tell people this. I don't know why I'm telling you." "Because I asked," Charlotte said quietly. "And because you've been carrying it alone for 2 years and it's heavy." Zaya looked at her across the small table with the coffee and the November wind and the lamp flickering between them, and his expression was the most unarmored she had ever seen it. "Yes," he said, "it is." She reached across the table and put her hand over his just briefly, just for a moment, and then took it back. He didn't move for a long second. Then he wrapped his fingers around his coffee cup and cleared his throat, and they talked about something else. But the conversation had been changed by it. Irrevocably. The way a room is changed when a window is finally opened. November brought with it a complication in the form of a man named Decker Halmy, who arrived in Caldwell Crossing on the morning stage with 3 associates, and a look about him that the older residents of the town recognized as trouble before he'd spoken a word. Halmy was a land speculator, specifically the kind who had begun working his way through the Texas Panhandle, buying up grazing rights and water access from ranchers who were struggling, then reselling at a profit to the large eastern cattle companies who were beginning to push their reach into the territory. He was not breaking any law that anyone could clearly name, but he had a talent for finding men at their lowest and offering just enough money to seem generous while taking 3 times as much in return. He came to see Isaiah on a Friday, riding out to the ranch unannounced in the late morning, and Charlotte happened to be there. She had come to help Martinez put up some weather insulation on the bunkhouse, a project that had been planned for a week, and so she was in the yard when Halmy's small party rode in. She heard the conversation through the open barn door, because Isaiah had taken Halmy into the barn rather than the house, which she understood was a deliberate choice. Barns were for business. Houses were for something else. Halmy was smooth and reasonable-voiced, and offered Isaiah $600 for a piece of water access along the eastern edge of his property, a creek access that was currently less valuable in drought terms, but would be critical in a wet spring. He presented it as a favor, as though he was doing Isaiah a tremendous kindness by relieving him of the burden of maintaining the access. "The Tanner spread sold their creek rights last month," Halmy said, his voice sliding through the barn walls like water under a door. "Made out very well." "The Tanner spread went under 6 weeks later," Isaiah said, and his voice was granite. Without creek access in a spring flood, they had no way to manage their herd through the east pasture. Coincidence, I'm sure. There was a pause. "Bristol," Halmy said, his tone changing slightly, "I'd encourage you to think carefully." "I have thought carefully," Isaiah said. "No." Charlotte exhaled against the barn wall and went back to what she was doing. Martinez, who was beside her, had been listening with the attentiveness of someone who very much needed to know the outcome. He relaxed by several degrees when he heard Isaiah's answer. "He tried the same approach last spring," Martinez said quietly. "With the McAllister homestead south of us. They sold. They were gone by summer." "Why does he want this specific land?" Charlotte asked. "Because Senor Bristol's land is good land," Martinez said simply, "and Halmy knows it." Halmy left within 20 minutes, and Isaiah came out of the barn with the look of a man who has won a small battle and knows there are larger ones coming. He saw Charlotte in the yard and walked over with the directness that was characteristic of him. "You heard that," he said. "I wasn't trying to." "I know." He looked out toward the gate where Halmy's party was receding. "He'll come back. Men like that always come back." "Then you'll say no again," Charlotte said. He looked at her with something that might, if you were being careful about not reading too much into it, be described as gratitude. "Yes," he said, "I will." The following week, Hester Doyle cornered Charlotte in the post office with the energy of someone about to deliver news they've been sitting on for a dangerous amount of time. He asked Thomas Carney whether there was a minister in the county who could perform a wedding on short notice, Hester announced. Charlotte looked up from her sorting. "Who did?" "Isaiah Bristol, last Saturday. Thomas Carney is the county clerk, you know." Hester's eyes were bright enough to read by. Now he didn't say who for, but Thomas said he looked, she paused for effect, like a man who had made up his mind about something and was proceeding with military efficiency. "Hester," Charlotte said carefully, "that could mean anything." "It could mean many things," Hester agreed, And it means one specific thing, and I think you know what it is." Charlotte did know what it was. But she also knew that Isaiah Bristol was a man who had been broken in specific ways. His wife, his child, his isolation, the way the house looked when she'd first come to it, and that a man like that did not rush into declarations easily or perhaps at all, and that she was not going to build anything on Hester Doyle's gossip. She went to the ranch that Thursday for what she told herself was a follow-up on a mending project, and which was actually just because Thursday had become a day she kept clear for no other appointments. And when Isaiah met her on the porch, he had an expression that she had never quite seen on him before. Purposeful, a little terrified. "Come sit on the porch," he said, which was unusual. They always went inside. Charlotte sat on the porch. The view from there was the plain stretching away to every horizon, the dry golden grass, the enormous sky doing its autumn business of clouds and cold light. The dog, whose name, she had learned, was Remnant, which she had thought at first was a strange name for a dog, and then had decided was exactly right, came, and put its head on her knee in a familiar way that suggested it had been doing this for weeks, which it had. Isaiah stood at the porch railing with his back to her for a moment, then turned around and sat in the other chair and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had come over the weeks to read as well as she read anything. And what she read in them now was a man who was about to say something real without armor. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to be clear about that from the start. I'm not a man who knows how to, I'm not." He stopped, tried again. "I have spent the last 2 years convincing myself that the right thing to do was to keep everything exactly as it was. Empty, manageable, nothing that could, another stop." He rubbed the back of his neck. "And then you came and fixed my shirts." Charlotte pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "And then you put the curtains back up," he continued, and his voice was lower now and very serious. "And made preserves in my kitchen and told me to get the window reglazed. And you," he looked at her directly, "you asked me about James. Nobody asks me about James. They don't know how or they're afraid of the answer. And you just asked, like he was real. Like he stopped and his jaw tightened and he worked through whatever that cost him. He was real. He is real. Nobody talks about him anymore and he's real," Charlotte said quietly. "He'll always be real, Isaiah." The sound of his name in her mouth seemed to do something to him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with everything down. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you'd be willing. I know I'm not easy company. And I know this house needs a great deal of work still. And I know I have no right to ask anything of you when you've already done more for this place than you were hired to. But I am asking. Because I think," he paused, and what came next was quiet and precise and entirely unadorned. "I think you are the finest person I have ever met, Charlotte Crawford. And I would very much like the chance to show you that I know the difference between being given a second life and wasting it." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Remnant shifted his head on her knee. The October wind came across the grass and moved through the porch. The curtains she had hung in the upstairs window shifted behind the glass. "I am willing," she said. "But I should tell you I am also not easy company. I have opinions about everything. I will tell you when you're wrong. I don't know how to be quiet about things that matter." "I know," Isaiah said, and for the first time in all the weeks she had known him, he smiled, a real one, not the barely there twitches of humor she'd caught before, but a full smile that changed his face completely and made her understand with sudden, helpless clarity why she had been coming out here every Thursday and Tuesday and occasionally Wednesday for a completely manufactured reason. "Then we understand each other," she said. "I believe we do," he said. The courting that followed was conducted with a deliberateness that suited both of them. They were neither of them young and foolish, and they had both seen enough of the world to know what mattered and what didn't. Isaiah came to town on Tuesdays without fail, and Charlotte came to the ranch on Thursdays, and they took long rides along the canyon edge on Saturdays when the weather allowed, and they talked without end. He showed her the whole of the ranch, the far pastures, the creek he'd refused to sell access to, the place where he'd built the first structure on the property, a small stone shelter that no longer served any purpose but that he'd never torn down. "Why not?" Charlotte asked, standing in front of it. It was barely large enough to stand up in, the stone rough-cut and mortared with more enthusiasm than skill. "I built it myself," Isaiah said from beside her. "First thing I ever built. I was 22 and I bought this land on money I'd saved for 6 years working other men's ranches. I thought if I could build one stone wall that held, I could build anything." He looked at the small shelter with something like affection. "It's not pretty." "No," Charlotte agreed, "but it held." He looked at her sideways. "Yes," he said, "it did." She told him on one of their Saturday rides about why she had really left New Mexico. Not just for work. She'd had enough work in Santa Fe. But because the man she had thought she might marry had turned out to be already married, and the discovery had been humiliating in a way that had made everything familiar feel contaminated. She had put as many miles between herself and that humiliation as she could. "I'm sorry," Isaiah said when she finished. They were riding slowly along the creek, their horses walking in companionable parallel. "I'm not anymore," Charlotte said. "I was for a long time, but I'm not now." He looked at her. "You ended up here." "I ended up here," she agreed. The look that passed between them on that afternoon was the kind that doesn't require words and doesn't benefit from them, and they rode the rest of the way back to the ranch in a silence that was entirely full. In December, Decker Halmy came back, as Isaiah had predicted. This time he brought a document, a legal claim, he said, to a portion of the water access based on an old survey discrepancy from 1869 that placed the creek boundary differently than Isaiah's own deed. He presented this at the county courthouse on a Monday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon the entire town knew about it. Isaiah rode into Caldwell Crossing in a state of controlled fury that Charlotte recognized as the most dangerous version of him, not the loud, explosive kind of anger but the cold, methodical kind. He found her at the post office, and she took one look at his face and said, "Tell me." He told her. The survey discrepancy was real, or at least real enough to require legal resolution, which would take time and money, and a lawyer who knew land law, the nearest of which was in Amarillo. Halmy had clearly been sitting on this information for months, waiting for the right moment, and had filed the claim now because winter was coming and a legal dispute would drag through spring and into the next grazing season, costing Isaiah in stress and distraction, and potentially in cattle if he couldn't work his full east pasture. "You need to write to Amarillo today," Charlotte said. "I know. And you need to pull your original deed and the 1869 survey record and compare them precisely. If there's a discrepancy, the question is which survey takes precedence, and that's a question for a land lawyer, but you need to be the one who knows the details before you walk into any room with one." Isaiah looked at her. "How do you know about land surveys?" "My father had 3 land disputes in Kansas," Charlotte said dryly. "I grew up learning what I needed to know." She was already reaching for paper and a pen from Mr. Lundquist's postal desk. "I'll help you draft the letter to Amarillo." "Do you have the deed at the house?" "Yes." "Bring it Thursday, we'll look at it together." She paused, pen in hand. "He's trying to break you down, Isaiah. He wants you to feel like the ground is shifting under you so you sell before the spring." "I know what he's doing." "Then don't let him." She said it simply and completely, and he straightened almost imperceptibly, the way a man does when someone says the thing he needed someone to say. They drafted the letter to the Amarillo land lawyer that afternoon, and Isaiah rode back to the ranch with a copy and Charlotte sent the original with the next morning stage. By Thursday they had the deed spread across Isaiah's kitchen table, and Charlotte was going through it with a methodical care that would have done credit to a lawyer, making notes in her small leather book. "Here," she said, pointing. "Your deed references the Wilson survey of 1868, not the 1869 revision. Halma's claim is based on the 1869 revision. If the 1868 survey is the controlling document for your deed, his claim has no legs." Isaiah leaned over the table beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. He looked at the deed, then at her notes, then at her. "How are you doing this?" "I read carefully," she said, "and I kept all my father's papers. I've seen what a land deed looks like when it's been put together properly versus when someone's tried to manipulate it afterward." She tapped the document. This was put together properly. The 1868 survey is referenced consistently throughout. The 1869 revision has different scope markers, see here. She pointed to the boundary description. "Halma's lawyer is betting that no one will catch this, or that you'll settle before a proper review." "He bet wrong," Isaiah said quietly, and there was something in his voice that was not just about the legal case. "He did," Charlotte said. She became aware that they were very close together over the table, and she straightened slightly, and he straightened too, and for a moment they stood very close in the warm kitchen with the winter light coming through the glazed window. She had made him get it properly reglazed in November, and the smell of coffee from the stove. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think," he stopped, tried a different approach. "I asked Thomas Carney about the county minister weeks ago. I'm aware that you probably know about it because this is Caldwell Crossing and Hester Doyle exists." Charlotte pressed her lips together. "I was not at that time certain enough to say anything. I am now certain." He turned to face her fully. "I would like to ask you to marry me. And I would like to be very clear that I am not asking because the house needs curtains or because I need my shirts mended. I am asking because," he paused, and she could see him searching for words that were adequate to what he was feeling and finding them inadequate and saying them anyway, which was brave. "Because you walked into this house and you saw every broken thing in it and you did not look away from any of it. Not the shirts, not the curtains, not James, not any of it. And you, Charlotte, you made it all feel like it was worth something again. Like I was worth something again." Charlotte's eyes were bright. She blinked twice. "I also think," he continued carefully, "that you are the smartest person in this county by a considerable margin, and the kindest, and the most honest, and that I will spend the rest of my life being interested in everything you think and say, and I very much want the chance to try." "Yes," Charlotte said. It came out immediately and completely, without the pause for deliberation that she would normally insist upon for important decisions. Because she had already deliberated in all the Thursdays and Tuesdays and Saturday rides, and the answer had been building to yes for months. "Yes, Isaiah, I'll marry you." He reached for her hand with both of his, and held it the way you hold something you've been waiting for and almost gave up on, and looked at her with those gray eyes entirely open, and she thought that he had been a man standing in the ruins of his life when she'd first come to that door, and she had not come to fix him. He didn't need fixing, not in that simple a sense, but she had come and she had stayed and she had been willing to see everything as it was, and he had seen her seeing it. And somehow that had made the difference. "Thursday," he said with a kind of quiet wonder. "You came back on a Thursday." "I always come back on Thursdays," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been counting on it." They were married on the 12th of January, 1874, in the Caldwell Crossing Church on a day so cold the minister's breath made clouds between the words of the ceremony. Charlotte wore her best dress, which was dark green wool, and had a collar she had embroidered herself over 3 evenings in December. Isaiah wore the best of his mended shirts and a jacket that he had ridden to Amarillo to have made, which Martinez had observed with transparent delight, and Isaiah had told him firmly not to mention. Hester Doyle was in the second row and was weeping openly and without apology by the exchange of vows. Martinez was in the third row and was not weeping, but his expression was that of a man who has been quietly right about something for a long time and has now been publicly vindicated. Thomas Carney attended as a witness. Even Mr. Abernathy came, in the good coat he only wore for significant occasions. The ring was a simple gold band that Isaiah had ordered from San Antonio. When he placed it on her finger and she placed the band she had made on his, Charlotte was aware of something settling into place that had been coming for months. not a dramatic shift, because the most important things rarely announce themselves dramatically, but a quieting, a sense of arrival. After the ceremony, they rode back to the ranch together in the cold January air, and the house was warm because Martinez had stoked every fireplace before riding ahead, and the curtains were gold and white in the bedroom window, and Remnant met them on the porch stairs and wagged with such enthusiasm that he nearly fell off. Isaiah helped Charlotte down from her horse, and they stood in the yard in the January cold looking at the house, and Charlotte saw what she had seen on her first visit, the house that had forgotten itself, and then she saw what it was now, which was different. The window was properly glazed. The porch boards on the south side had been replaced. The flower beds along the front path had been cleared, ready for spring planting. It was not yet what it would be, but it had the look of a place that was working towards something. "It needs more work," Isaiah said beside her, reading the direction of her gaze. "Everything does," Charlotte said. "That's fine. We have time." The land dispute with Decker Halmy resolved in February, when the Amarillo lawyer, a precise, energetic man named Calloway who charged a great deal, and was worth every cent, successfully argued before the county judge that Isaiah's 1868 deed survey was the controlling document, and that Halma's 1869 revision, upon examination, showed signs of having been selectively applied across multiple properties in ways that were irregular at best and fraudulent at worst. The judge did not rule fraud. The evidence wasn't quite solid enough for that legal threshold, but he dismissed Halma's claim entirely and noted for the court record that the survey methodology in question was of questionable reliability. Halmy left Caldwell Crossing within a month after two other ranchers followed Charlotte's example of careful examination and found similar irregularities in the claims against their land. He moved on to the next county, which was the best outcome anyone could reasonably hope for. Isaiah paid Calloway, shook his hand, and rode home to tell Charlotte. She was in the kitchen. It had become her kitchen now. She had reorganized it with Martinez's delighted cooperation in the first week of their marriage, making cornbread and not looking particularly anxious, because she had read the legal documents herself and had believed they were solid. "It's done," he said from the doorway. "Dismissed." "Good," she said, and put the cornbread in the oven. Then she turned around and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, and he held her with the particular quality of a man who has been tense for 2 months and is only now remembering how to be otherwise. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "You did it," she said. "You held the land." "We held the land," he said. "You found the survey discrepancy." "We held the land," Charlotte conceded. Spring arrived in March, windy and contrary, and Charlotte planted the flower beds along the front path. She put in what she knew would grow in the Texas Panhandle climate, lantana and black-eyed Susans, and a hardy rose variety that Hester Doyle's sister grew successfully in Amarillo and had shared cuttings of, packed in damp newspaper on the stage. Isaiah built a new planting bed on the south side of the house for vegetables, because Charlotte had views on self-sufficiency that he had come to find entirely reasonable. He built it carefully, and she watched him work with his hands and thought again about the stone shelter that it held because he'd willed it to. They hired a second hand in April, a quiet young man named Percy Ford who had been working the Tanner spread before its collapse, and who was honest and hardworking, and who, within a week, had somehow become Martinez's younger brother in everything but blood. The ranch felt different with 2 hands and a full kitchen, and the sound of Charlotte's voice carrying through the house on a regular basis. Not like a house that was trying to be empty anymore, but like a house that was being lived in. In May, Charlotte discovered she was expecting a child. She told Isaiah on a Thursday evening, because Thursdays were still their day, had remained their day even after the Thursday visits had become unnecessary, because she lived there sitting on the porch with Remnant at their feet and the spring evening going gold across the grass. She had been thinking about how to say it, and then decided, as she generally did, that the simplest approach was best. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. Isaiah turned to look at her with the speed of a man who has been very still and is suddenly very much the opposite. His expression cycled through several things very quickly: surprise, joy, something close to terror, and then something deeper and slower that was harder to name. "Are you certain?" "I've been certain for a week," she said. "I waited to be fully certain before telling you." He reached for her hand. He held it, both of his around hers, the way he had when he'd asked her to marry him. "How are you feeling?" "Tired in the mornings, fine otherwise." She looked at him carefully. "Isaiah, are you all right?" He was quiet for a moment. She understood what the quiet was. James, who had lived 3 days, was in that silence. She let it be there. She didn't try to talk around it or through it. "Yes," he said finally. Yes." He looked out at the spring grass, the gold evening. "I am afraid," he said honestly. "I want to tell you that so you know, not to worry you, but because I think being afraid of this particular thing is reasonable, and I don't want to pretend I'm not." "Being afraid is reasonable," Charlotte agreed. "And I will tell you that I am also afraid for my own reasons, and that I think we will both be afraid for a while, and that it will be all right." "How do you know?" he asked. "I don't," she said simply, "but I think it will be anyway." He turned and looked at her with those open gray eyes, and he lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, and held it there for a moment. "I think so too," he said. The summer of 1874 was hot and demanding, as Texas summers are, and the cattle work was relentless, and the heat was constant, and Charlotte continued her mending business through most of it, because she was practical and did not intend to sit idle, though she confined her work to the ranch now rather than riding into town daily. And Hester Doyle rode out to visit her twice a week with the energy of a woman who has adopted someone into her family without asking permission. Hester was there in August when Charlotte went into labor, and so was a capable midwife named Mrs. Ortega, who had delivered most of the babies in a 30-mile radius for the past 15 years, and had a manner so calm that it imposed calm on everyone around her. Isaiah was in the outer room through the whole of it, which was where he was expected to be, and Martinez kept him company and kept the coffee hot and pretended to be calm himself. At 4 in the morning on the 18th of August, 1874, Charlotte Crawford Bristol delivered a boy, healthy and emphatic in his opinion of the world's shortcomings, with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined expression. Isaiah came in when Mrs. Ortega said he could, and Charlotte was propped against the pillows looking exhausted and entirely at peace, and the baby was in her arms making small furious sounds. Isaiah sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, his son, his living son, with an expression of such raw intensity that Hester and Mrs. Ortega quietly left the room and pulled the door to. "He looks angry," Isaiah said. "He just arrived," Charlotte said. "He has opinions about it." Isaiah reached out and touched his son's cheek with one finger very gently, and the baby turned toward the touch with the reflex that babies have, and Isaiah made the same small sound he'd made the day Charlotte had hung the curtains, private and involuntary and not meant to be heard. Charlotte heard it and said nothing. "What shall we call him?" Isaiah asked. Charlotte had thought about this. "I thought if you agreed we might call him James," she said quietly. "For the one who came before him, not to replace him. Just so the name is here, so it's in the air." Isaiah looked at her, his jaw worked. He was silent for a moment in the way that meant something very large was moving through him and he was managing the edges of it. "James," he said. "If you want," Charlotte said, "or not, it was only a thought." "James," he said again, differently this time, firmly, like a door closing in the right direction. "Yes, that's his name." Hester, beyond the door, had heard enough of this to require the use of her handkerchief. James Bristol grew into a boy with his father's stubbornness, and his mother's sharp eyes, and an opinion on every subject he encountered, which his mother found gratifying and his father found occasionally exhausting and generally admirable. The ranch grew too, through the late 1870s, as Isaiah expanded the herd carefully and steadily in the way of a man who had learned patience the hard way and was now its master. He rebuilt the east wing of the house properly, with good lumber and a carpenter from Amarillo, and Charlotte had a proper workroom for her sewing, because she never entirely gave up the work, not least because she loved it, and because she had a talent for it that felt like something her mother had given her and she was not willing to put down. Percy Ford stayed. Martinez stayed. Remnant, in defiance of all actuarial expectation, stayed until James was 3 years old and had learned to walk by hauling himself upright on the old dog's back. And then Remnant went to sleep on the porch stairs one evening and did not wake up, which was the most dignified exit a dog had ever made. And James cried, and Isaiah buried Remnant under the south corner of the porch where the sun hid in the morning, and put a small stone marker there. And Charlotte thought that a man who buried a dog with a stone marker, and his name on it, was a man worth every Thursday she had ever cleared for him. In 1877, Charlotte had a second child, a daughter, Clara, who arrived in spring with considerably more cooperation than her brother had shown at his own arrival, and who had Charlotte's brown hair and Isaiah's gray eyes, and who, from the first month of her life, displayed a temperament so serene and practical that her mother recognized it as her own and her father recognized it as something considerably better than his. James was 3 and extremely invested in the new arrival, mostly because he had decided the baby was his personal project, which Charlotte allowed while maintaining careful supervision of what this interest produced in practice. The house was full. It was full in a way that houses are when they have been empty and have come all the way back, not just with people but with the sound of them, the daily unremarkable texture of life lived together. Boots at the door in 3 sizes, a sewing basket in the workroom next to an accounting ledger, curtains gold and white in the bedroom window, preserves in the cellar, a flower bed along the front path that came in every spring, and that Charlotte tended with the satisfaction of someone who knows that growing things require consistency and patience, and will reward both. One October evening in 1878, 5 years after Charlotte had first ridden out to the ranch with her sewing basket and her spine of iron, Isaiah came in from the evening check of the cattle to find her in the kitchen at the work table, mending by lamplight. James was asleep. Clara was asleep. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet after children have been in them, a settled, warm quiet, populated by memory of the day's sounds. Isaiah stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her without her knowing, the way he had learned to do in the early weeks and had never stopped, because watching Charlotte work was one of his favorite things in the world, the clean economy of her movements, the absolute focus, the way her needle moved like she was having a private conversation with the cloth. She looked up and saw him. "Come in," she said. "You're letting the cold in." He came in and sat at the table across from her, and pulled the lamp closer so the light was better for her, and she glanced at him with the corner of her mouth lifting. He had been doing the lamp for years. He always adjusted the lamp when he sat near her working. He wasn't sure she'd noticed. She had noticed. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her needle moving. "This house," he said, "how it is now versus how it was." She smiled at the work in her lap. "That's a long comparison. 5 years. Just over 5, yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the lamplight. "I was thinking," he said, "about the day you came, the first day. You stepped over the dog and knocked on the door and told me my shirt had a tear in the shoulder seam." Charlotte laughed, a real laugh, soft but full. "I did. I thought," he paused. "I thought you were extraordinary and it frightened me and I was very rude." "You were not rude," Charlotte said. "You said whatever you're selling, I don't need it," which was slightly rude. "Slightly," he allowed. She set down her mending and looked at him across the lamp. The 5 years were visible in both of them, not harshly, but in the way that time writes itself gently on people who have been living well. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had deepened. Her hands were more calloused. They had grown into each other the way 2 trees do when they're planted close enough, distinct still, but changed by the proximity, stronger for it. "Isaiah," she said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the ranch was still under the enormous Texas sky, and inside the house was the sleeping sound of children and the settling sound of good walls and the smell of lamp oil and the remnant warmth of the cook stove. "Yes," he said. Not simply. There was nothing simple about it. Nothing that discounted James, who had lived 3 days, or Alina, who had gone in 12. Nothing that erased the years of emptiness that had preceded this moment. He held all of that and the happiness at the same time, because that was what living required, and he had learned it. "Yes, Charlotte, I am happy." She picked up her mending again, and the needle moved, and the lamplight held them in its small, warm circle. "So am I," she said. The spring of 1879 brought a new challenge to the Bristol ranch. As springs in the Texas Panhandle tend to do, not Decker Halmy, who had been heard of a few times in distant counties and had eventually, by all accounts, run his scheme into a legal corner in Lubbock and departed Texas entirely. But a drought that settled over the region in March and held on with a grim persistence through April and into May. The creek that Isaiah had refused to sell access to became more valuable by the week, and 2 neighboring ranchers, Gus Whitmore to the north and Abel Price to the south, were in difficult straits. Isaiah rode to see Whitmore on a Tuesday morning and came back that evening looking thoughtful. Charlotte was in the vegetable garden when he came back, which had been expanded twice over the years and now produced enough that she put up preserves and canned goods through the fall with enough to share. She looked at him and read his expression with the fluency of a woman who has been reading this particular face for 5 years. "What did you decide?" she asked. He looked at her. "I'm going to share creek access with Whitmore and Price through the dry season. No charge. That will cost you in water management for the east pasture. I know. Percy and I worked it out. We can rotate the herd." He leaned against the garden fence. "These men have been good neighbors. Whitmore helped me rebuild the east fence line after the storm 2 years back. Price lent me his breaking horse when mine went lame last fall. The creek is mine and I'll keep it mine, but keeping it and hoarding it are different things." Charlotte looked at him steadily. Then she nodded. "Yes, they are. I thought you'd say I was giving away too much." "I might have said that once," Charlotte allowed. "Early on, before I understood that you don't build anything lasting in this country by yourself." She pulled a weed from between 2 rows of beans. "Tell Martinez to take the Whitmore family some of the preserved goods from the cellar when he rides over, the ones I put up in the fall." Isaiah watched her with that expression she had seen often in the last 5 years, not admiration exactly, which was too simple a word for it, something more like wonder at how complete a person could be when they were entirely themselves. "You are the best person I know," he said. Charlotte looked up from the garden. "You say that too often for me to take proper credit for it." "I say it exactly as often as it's true," Isaiah said, "which is every day." She stood up from the garden, brushing dirt from her hands, and walked over to the fence and looked at him with the directness she had never once softened in all the years she'd known him, and he had never once asked her to. "I love you," she said, "in case that is not sufficiently obvious." "It is obvious," he said. "I love you too, in case you required the words." "I always require the words," she said. "I'm a woman of letters," he laughed. It was the full laugh, the one she'd been hearing for 5 years, and it still did to her what it had done the first time she'd heard it, made the whole day feel worth exactly what it had cost. They stood at the garden fence in the spring morning while the Texas sky did what it always did, and the grass moved, and somewhere in the barn Martinez was singing something in Spanish that he only sang when he was in good spirits, which was often. By June the drought had eased, as droughts eventually do when they've made their point, and the creek was running properly, and the east pasture was green enough for the full herd, and Whitmore and Price had come through the dry season with their herds intact. Whitmore came over for supper in July with his wife and their 2 boys, and Price came the following week, and it became a summer of neighboring people going back and forth, sharing tables and information, and the general knowledge that the land was large and difficult, and the sensible response to both of these facts was to not try to meet them entirely alone. James, who was 4, had decided that Abel Price's eldest son Henry, who was 7, was the most interesting person in his immediate world, and this friendship was conducted with an intensity and exclusivity that reminded Charlotte powerfully of herself at a similar age. She let James ride over to the Price spread once a week on the condition that he stayed on the path and arrived where he was going. "He's going to fall off that horse," Isaiah said, watching his son depart with the fearless seat of a small boy who has been on horseback since he could walk. "He will fall off that horse many times," Charlotte agreed, "and every time he'll get back on." She glanced at Isaiah. "He gets that from you. The falling or the getting back on?" "Both," she said. Clara, at 2, was already following her brother's example in several things and her mother's in several more, which resulted in a child who was both serene and absolutely implacable, a combination that Charlotte considered ideal, and that Isaiah considered, with loving resignation, as something he had brought entirely on himself by marrying a woman of strong character. Clara had also taken a deep interest in Charlotte's sewing basket, which she was allowed to examine under supervision, and she had discovered the particular satisfaction of threading a large blunt needle and pulling it through fabric, which she did with a concentration that reminded Charlotte so strongly of her own first attempts at needlework that it made her chest ache pleasantly. "She's going to learn to sew," Charlotte told Isaiah one evening. "Of course she is," he said. "She's your daughter. And James. James is going to learn cattle and land management." He paused. "And also to sew if he wants to, whatever he needs." Charlotte looked at him over her book. "You know," she said, "you are considerably less stern than you appeared that first day." "I appeared how I was," he said. "I was very stern that first day. You were terrifying, actually. And yet you stood on my porch and told me my shirt was torn." "Someone had to," Charlotte said serenely and returned to her book. In the autumn of 1879, Isaiah took on a third ranch hand, a man named Theodore Birch, a Choctaw man who had drifted west after the Indian Territory disruptions of the previous decade, and who had a gift with horses that was immediately obvious. Theodore worked quietly and well and fit himself into the rhythm of the ranch without disruption, and Isaiah paid him fairly and directly, which was not universal practice in the region, and Charlotte thought again about the kinds of justice that were possible in the small specific choices that a person made every day. Theodore, for his part, observed the Bristol household with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading a place before trusting it, and what he read there satisfied him, and he stayed. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold but not brutal, and Charlotte spent the months in her workroom with a project she had been planning for several years, a proper catalog of her services, neatly written and illustrated with small, precise drawings of stitch types, which she intended to circulate among the women of Caldwell Crossing and the neighboring settlements as a teaching document. She had been quietly thinking about this for a long time. There were women in the territory who needed skills and had no one to teach them, who could earn their own living with needle and thread if they had the foundation. Charlotte intended to provide the foundation. "You're writing a book," Isaiah said, appearing in the doorway of the workroom one February evening and looking at the spread of papers on her table. "I'm writing a teaching document," Charlotte said. "It has 12 pages. Teaching takes space." He came in and looked at the papers and then at the careful illustrations she'd made and then at her. "You're going to teach other women to do this. If they want to learn, I thought I might hold sessions in town. Mrs. Hargrove's parlor is large enough." "Saturday mornings." "Charlotte," he said. She looked up. He paused. "This is wonderful. It's practical," she said. "It needs doing." "It's wonderful," he repeated firmly, and she let him say it. The Saturday morning sewing sessions began in March 1880 and were, from the first week, more popular than Charlotte had predicted and less organized than she had hoped, which were two problems that solved each other. Women came from Caldwell Crossing and from surrounding spreads, some experienced and some with no more ability than goodwill, and Charlotte taught patiently and precisely, and without condescension, and within 2 months had a rotating group of 12 regular attendees and a waiting list that required her to add a second morning session. Hester Doyle attended every Saturday, which was not strictly necessary as Hester already knew how to sew, but Hester was providing the social ballast, and Charlotte understood this and was grateful. Isaiah came to pick Charlotte up from the sessions on the Saturdays when she didn't bring the horse herself, and he would stand in Mrs. Hargrove's front hall while the women finished, and there was always a moment when he and Charlotte would catch each other's eyes across the room and exchange the private look of two people who are entirely in the middle of their life together and know it. In the spring of 1881, Charlotte learned she was expecting their third child. She told Isaiah on a Thursday evening in the kitchen the same way she had told him about James, because some things deserve to happen the same way the first time did. He took her hands and held them and said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "And you're happy about it?" "Are you?" "Deeply," he said without hesitation. "Frightened, but deeply happy." "Then so am I," Charlotte said. Their second son was born in October 1881 in the same bedroom where James had been born, with Mrs. Ortega attending. She was still practicing at 63, and had a manner so unshakable that Charlotte had requested her specifically, and Hester Doyle somewhere in the house, providing a level of emotional support that was heard through two closed doors. Isaiah was in the outer room with Martinez and Theodore, who had become part of the family fabric in every way that mattered. The boy was born healthy and large, with a shout of protest that made Martinez laugh on the other side of the door, and Isaiah stand up very fast from his chair. He had Charlotte's brown hair and his own combination of features that would take years to settle into anything definitive, and he was named William, for no particular historic reason, but because both Isaiah and Charlotte had looked at him, and the name had appeared between them simultaneously. James, now 7, received the news of a second brother with philosophical acceptance, and immediately began planning the older brother education he intended to provide. Clara, now 4, sat beside her mother's bed and looked at the baby William with a proprietary expression that suggested she intended to be involved in every aspect of his upbringing regardless of what anyone else had planned. "She's going to run this family," Isaiah said quietly from his place beside Charlotte's bed. "She already is," Charlotte said. The years that followed were full in all the ways that years can be full when the foundation is solid. The ranch grew. The children grew. The Saturday sewing sessions became an institution in Caldwell Crossing, and Charlotte had trained 3 of the original 12 women well enough that they could teach in turn, which was the thing she'd intended from the beginning, not dependence but propagation. She reduced her own sessions to once a month and used the freed time for her workroom and her family, and the long rides she still took across the eastern pastures in the good weather, sometimes alone and sometimes with Isaiah. They still came back on Thursdays, not on any particular errand or with any external purpose, but because Thursday had been the thread through the whole of it, and they kept it. After the children were older and in bed, Thursday evenings were theirs, the porch in the warm months, the kitchen in the cold ones, coffee and lamplight, and the conversation that never seemed to run out because they were interested in each other, which was the basic engine of everything. Isaiah's hair had gone silver at the temples by 1885, which Charlotte had been watching happen with an interest she declined to describe as admiration. He was 33 when they had married and in his 40s now, and he wore his age well. He had a face that had been built for it, the kind of face that improves rather than diminishes, and Charlotte told him so. "You're biased," he said. "I'm accurate," she said. "I'm always accurate." "Yes," he said, with the smile that had never stopped doing what it did to her. "That's true." They were sitting on the porch in the early summer of 1885 when James, now 11, already as tall as his mother and heading rapidly for his father's height, came across the yard with the loose-limbed energy of a boy who has been running and has not quite remembered to stop. "Papa," he announced, "I want to learn the accounts." Isaiah looked at his son. "You're 11. I know, but I want to learn now. Martinez says you were running your first ranch accounts at 14 and I want to start earlier." He said this with the particular confidence of a child who has been raised by people who have opinions and has formed several of his own. Charlotte from her chair said nothing and looked at the garden with an expression of careful neutrality. "Who told you I started at 14? Isaiah said. Martinez. Martinez talks too much. Martinez says you say that a lot." Isaiah looked at his wife. Charlotte's expression of careful neutrality intensified slightly. He looked back at his son. "Come in on Saturday morning," he said. "I'll show you the ledger." James nodded with satisfaction and went back across the yard. Isaiah looked at Charlotte. "You knew he was going to ask." "He told me on Wednesday," Charlotte admitted. "I thought it was better coming from him. You could have warned me." "And miss your face," she said serenely. He laughed. 13 years and the laugh still did it. She looked at her garden and let herself be privately, enormously happy. In 1887, the town of Caldwell Crossing incorporated properly and elected its first mayor, Thomas Carney, who had spent 15 years as county clerk and was exactly the right kind of careful, steady man for the job. One of his first official acts was to establish a proper school, which Caldwell Crossing had been managing without for too long, and he came to Charlotte specifically to ask if she would serve on the small committee establishing the curriculum. Charlotte served on the committee, and the school opened in the autumn of 1888 with Mr. Abernathy as head teacher and 2 younger teachers from Amarillo. James was already past the age of the school's curriculum and was working the ranch full-time alongside his father, learning accounts and land management, and cattle with a seriousness that Isaiah said reminded him of himself, and Charlotte said was somewhat alarming. Clara attended school for 2 years and then announced she had learned what was useful and would like to pursue the rest of her education through books, which she had been doing independently with great success. And Charlotte and Isaiah conferred and agreed that Clara's position was sound and that they would continue ordering books from the catalog. William attended school with a cheerful sociability that suggested he was going to spend most of his life getting people to like him, which was a skill Charlotte privately considered underrated. In 1890, James was 16 and beginning to carry more of the daily ranch operation on his shoulders, because Isaiah had developed a persistent cough through the winter that had eventually resolved, but had left him with a recommendation from the Amarillo doctor to ease his workload. It was not serious. The doctor was clear about this, and Isaiah was clear in his refusal to be concerned about it. But Charlotte watched her husband carefully through the spring, and made sure he slept enough and ate enough, and came in from the cold when he said he would, and did all of this without making him feel managed, which was an art she had long since perfected. By summer he was fully recovered, and the doctor in Amarillo had declared him in excellent health for a man of his age, and Isaiah had spent some months being a man in excellent health with enormous enjoyment. "You worried about me," he said to Charlotte one evening with the tone of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis. "I worry about you regularly," she said. "You're my husband. I'm fine. You are now. You were not fine in January. It was a cough. It was a cough that lasted 6 weeks and had you up at 3 in the morning." He was quiet for a moment. "Were you afraid?" Charlotte looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "I was afraid. I will always be afraid of losing you, Isaiah, and I will never pretend otherwise because I don't pretend about things that matter." She paused. "But you are here, and you are well, and the fear is not the biggest thing. The biggest thing is that you are here." He reached across and took her hand the way he did with both of his around hers. He held it for a long moment. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I know," she said. "You better not." The new century came toward them across the 1890s like weather on the horizon visible from a long way off, approaching steadily, carrying change. The cattle market shifted. The railroad came closer, which was both opportunity and disruption. Texas was changing around them, the Panhandle filling in, the frontier quality of the land giving way to something more organized and less wild and more complicated. Isaiah adapted, as he had always adapted, with the patience of a man who understands that the only things worth keeping are worth fighting for, and the wisdom to know the difference between fighting and holding on after the holding is done. He expanded into some of the railroad-adjacent opportunities, selling direct to the eastern markets through the new shipping systems, and contracted wisely in areas where the market had shifted. James, at 18, was his full partner in the operation, and their working relationship was one of the things Charlotte loved most in her days, to watch father and son across the breakfast table with the ledger between them, arguing about pasture rotation with the identical set, jaw that was the most visible genetic inheritance Isaiah had passed along. Clara, at 17, had read through the ranch's library twice, and had begun corresponding with a women's college in Austin that offered courses by correspondence. Isaiah had read the prospectus with great seriousness and funded the correspondence enrollment without being asked, which had resulted in Clara hugging him with a force that he had clearly not anticipated and had clearly found entirely worthwhile. William, at 14, had decided he was going to be a veterinarian, which had surprised his parents initially, and upon reflection had surprised them not at all, because he had been informally doctoring every injured animal on the ranch since he was 7. The household was full and loud and purposeful, and Charlotte moved through it at the center, as she had from the beginning, not loudly, but fundamentally, the way a foundation is not seen but holds everything above it. She still had her workroom. She still did her own mending and occasionally others, though the Saturday sessions had long since graduated to a rotation of competent local teachers, and Charlotte's role was now largely advisory and celebratory. She still had her leather book, its pages long since replaced several times over, with the careful accounts of her work and her life recorded in her precise handwriting. She still put up preserves in the fall. The flower beds along the front path were 30 years old now, well established, perennial, coming in every spring without being asked. The curtains in the bedroom were gold and white in the afternoon light, replaced once when the originals had finally given out, replaced with fabric she had found that was close enough to Aline's original choice, because some things were worth honoring. Isaiah had never asked her to. She had done it because she understood. On an evening in the late autumn of 1893, Isaiah found Charlotte at the window of the bedroom, looking out at the last of the sunset. He came and stood beside her, and they looked at the plains together, the grass golden in the autumn evening, the sky enormous and purple-dark at the eastern edge, the lights of what had become a much larger Caldwell crossing visible in the middle distance. "I've been thinking," Charlotte said. "About what?" "About that first Thursday," she said. "I was packing my basket to leave. You asked me about the curtains, and then you asked me to stay for supper. I remember. I was going to say no. I had made up my mind to say no, because staying for supper seemed like exactly the kind of complication I didn't need." She looked at the last of the sunset. "And then I thought about my tin of crackers in my room." Isaiah made a sound that was mostly amusement. "I stayed because of crackers," Charlotte said. "I want you to know that. At the very beginning, the decision was made on the basis of crackers." "I'm grateful to the crackers," he said. "So am I." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and they stood at the curtained window while the sunset finished its business across the Texas sky. "Isaiah," she said. "Yes." "Do you remember what you said? When you asked me to marry you, you said you hoped to show me you knew the difference between being given a second life and wasting it." "I remember." "You haven't wasted a moment of it," she said, quietly, "completely." He pressed his mouth to the top of her head and held it there for a long moment. Outside, the stars were coming up the way they always did over the Panhandle, enormous, immediate, each one certain of its own importance. "Neither have you," he said. The house behind them was full of the evening sounds, James's voice from somewhere downstairs, Clara's footsteps along the hall on her way to her reading, William's laughter from the kitchen, where he was almost certainly feeding something to whoever's dog he had befriended most recently, Martinez somewhere singing. The house that had been empty and had come all the way back. She had come to mend his shirts. She had come for 50 cents and rent money and a tin of crackers. She had stepped over a sleeping dog and knocked on a door and met a man who was the ruin and the substance of himself in equal measure, and she had not looked away from either part, and he had not looked away from her. She had mended the shirts. She had mended more than that, not fixed it the way a tear is fixed, sewn up and closed as though it never was, but mended in the true sense, which is not to erase but to hold together, to make serviceable what had come apart, to let the repair be visible and strong and lasting. The house was mended. The man was mended. Not into what he had been before his losses. That was not possible, nor should it be, but into something that had room for all of it, the grief and the living both, the curtains and the cedar trunk both. James, who had lived 3 days, and James, who was downstairs arguing about pasture rotation. Charlotte Bristol stood at her bedroom window in the autumn evening with her husband's arm around her and 20 years of this life behind them, and felt the satisfaction of a woman who has done her work well and knows it. The stars came up over the Texas Panhandle. The house held everything it was meant to hold, and Thursday was coming again, as it always did, and they would be there for it.